Thank you for us, Tom, Tetsuya, and Sanjit to be here. To warm up, there were actually a lot of questions, but I think some of the questions were answered during the course of the talk. So, yeah. So I'll just start with a few questions which I think were not covered, or maybe could be, we could add some more color here on the panel. So one of the key questions, I think, because this is a developer crowd, so one of the key, we're all saying that, developers are going to make this next revolution possible. We don't know what the next killer app should be. And, a big part of it is collaboration for the developers is open source projects, right? So when a developer is looking at contributing or selecting an open source to work on a particular problem, because if you look at open source jungle today, for any particular problem, there are like 10 open source projects spawned. So what should a developer look at when they look at selecting an open source project?
Very good question. So as you did say that, most of these developers are sort of swimming in the ocean of GitHubs and open source and all of that, et cetera, is very obvious. But more importantly is the developers need to think about really the platform, right? What are the platforms that they are trying to build their infrastructure on it? And if they look at really, for example, if they're picking up a I'm just Apache Spark, for example, right? They need to look at really, is Apache Spark or, is good enough for machine learning or DB? Can I attach it to Kafka? And most of what is happening in the infrastructure of cloud, you need these pub/sub models where you need to subscribe and publish to this, some kind of bus, in your platform. And you need to be able to attach it to different form or shape of the open source solution and all that. So the first thing I would look at really, how the platform that I'm picking for my applications to be developed, how popular is it? What kind of interface support does it have? And of course, the language is important. Are there a lot of tools for it, like from, let's say, perspective of the interest that the open source community has. Python, for example, provides lots of libraries, and there are, of course, other programming languages that are emerging, Go and even, concurrent processing and all of that. So it depends really where developer is going. When it comes to networking, I would make sure that whatever platform I pick, it can attach to some kind of high performance bus, and optimization capability such as Kafka.
Thank you.
So I teach entrepreneurship at UC Berkeley, and a lot of my students this semester are PhD students and postdocs. And one of the nice things about the UC system is the knowledge that you're creating is public domain. And so effectively sort of an open source model to everything they build. So the question always becomes, how do they actually start making money off of their innovations? And one of my suggestions is, if you're going to be building everything for the world, make sure that you build a part of the universe for yourself as well. And so if you're going to go out and open source a bunch of stuff, great, do so, but find some verticalized instance of it that you're able to build a business upon, and then take the pieces that are sort of the work that you don't mind if somebody else becomes an expert into it and open that up for other people. But if you don't start at it from the perspective of solving one problem really well, it's going to be a flop.
Yeah, that's exactly, I fully agree with both of you guys. And so some of the very important criteria, as Tom pointed to, what kind of a platform, or open source community who makes sense or fit with some particular developer, is one of the very important KPI or criteria to select any appropriate platform is fully depend on what kind of application at the end of the day is targeted. Without any target, very intense, target application and start something, it might be mess. But if we focus, developer focus on what kind of a very specific problem for some particular area, then in many people agree and get together, maybe they can solve it. Otherwise, as long as I see, I don't say any particular name, but some particular open source project is just develop something without any concrete ultimate goal mean application. Because at the end of the day, so how to make it a business is a very success story. That's why I would say application is very important to pick up any appropriate open source platform.
I agree with everything that was said. The only thing to add is I typically am a fan of verticalized use cases. So whenever developers are looking to take on a particular problem, hey, I want to jump into this for the open source world, it is important to also understand which vertical will this be most applicable towards. I'm less a fan of generic horizontal solutions. At an infrastructure level, yes, you have to be very horizontal, makes sense. But then after that, as you start rising up the stack just a little bit, you start realizing the data needs are different, even the network needs are different. Every vertical, you take healthcare versus fintech as examples, things change from a data standpoint completely. So it's hard to create something that says, hey, that transcends verticals, especially if you want to get tens of thousands of users on that project.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm hearing is choose your platform wisely, choose a vertical use case, develop for it, develop well, stay away from lukewarm. I like to use that example a lot. I don't know if any of you have heard of this example in marketing, right? So if somebody wants cold tea and somebody wants hot tea, don't serve them lukewarm tea. Nobody's going to be happy. Yeah. So the community, basically, the community behind the open source project is important too. Yeah. So just for the recording, so the comment is that similar to DPDK, there was ODP and DPI, and there was another project you mentioned. So, but in the end, DPDK seems to be the de facto in the industry.
So, from a personal, as an entrepreneur experience, I would say you've got to focus on something that pays your bills, and services are great, but they're not repeatable, and it's not a long-term. I mean, it's a different business model, and if you're going to do it off of an open source model, there's really only one Red Hat that succeeded in the open source model on that type of model. So my argument is always, if you're going to build it, do it, fine, let other people benefit from it, but you've got to have some product-based value proposition that you're extracting from it. Because without those models of success, nobody else cares. Why is anybody else going to try to go out and do it? Because if all they're going to do is get another services revenue stream out of it, that's not something that's going to scale and make lots of people lots of money real quick, or even over time.
So the question is how to differentiate in this white box open source environment, because even the new ideas you cannot monetize because it is going to become open source. Any comments on
that? That's a good question. But really, the past, people, basically try to lock the vendors that try to make it purposeful. They put a cover on it. They have lots of open source in it, but they don't say what's in it and all of that. That model really doesn't work anymore. I mean, operators cannot afford to have forklift every 6 months or every year anymore. They cannot be like, take the switch out, have to give you a bigger ASIC, anymore and all of that. So having said that, let's assume that you come with some solution that runs in a white box, and our application is running on it. You're getting some user fee or license fee and all of that, and you have to scale it, right? So because you were the original developer of that environment, I'm sure you're thinking about the next step. You know that where the trends are going. So therefore, you can bring back a new software, especially if you have designed your environment. You can push new image, easily. I think that's an opportunity. I mean, even open source is not free necessarily, right? Doesn't mean because it's called open source is free. It means that people who have developed that application, that platform, that environment, they know the best how to debug it, how to fix it, how to enhance it, and all of that. So I would really see this whole thing, white box and open source and Tabasco sauce applications, all as opportunities for everyone. It's not good old days anymore that you just put a cover, white label it, and and if you want any new features, come and see me, right? I mean that doesn't work anymore. Honestly.
Because now I'm in the cable, but as I mentioned myself, so when I was in NTT Docomo, definitely, ideally, if a carrier like AT&T or NTT or Verizon, whoever, just introduce and deploy the open source and white box solution as is, almost no cost. But the fact is, it's very hard to do that because operator ourselves need to compete to each other. So some secret source is needed on top of any common reference platform like ONAP or code or whatever. So that's why realistic way is that even open source have as much as possible to leverage any open source and white box basis solution as a reference, but without any secret source in a kind of a proprietary things, it's very hard to compete with operators' competitors. So that's why still, some such kind of a value added is needed not only for vendors, business, but also operators' business.
What was the question? Does the value of open source and white box?
Is your question that does the use of open source or white box, does that diminish the value of the solution that AT&T and Cable Labs are buying?
From our perspective, no. In fact, it actually is almost really hard now to come in with proprietary-only based solutions because ultimately, it's the applications that should be unique and have differences in it. Ultimately, we want to make the cost of creating the infrastructure and operating the infrastructure as low as possible. But what gets built on those, what services are accessible, what are the things that people want, those have to be differentiated and have to have things that people are going to be able to get benefit out of. That said, we want to. What is our major motivation for looking for vendors who are using open source into it is, frankly, it gives us some flexibility of not being locked in. Our primary problem in the past was any new services that we wanted to create were in locked-in environments, proprietary software, proprietary hardware. Now go out and add something else to it. Well, you have to go back to the original vendor, and that kind of means that you can't innovate. You don't control your own destiny as an operator. So for us right now, honestly, we're looking at it not from a perspective of diminishing value of it. In fact, if anything, if you don't have it, we don't really want it right now. Go ahead. So exactly right. But the thing is that your differentiation should probably not, in our world, what we would like is for you to make the contributions of the parts that you think of as sort of plumbing stuff that anybody's going to need, to make that sort of a level playing field, and then differentiate on what you're really good at. And sure, the infrastructure had to get to a point where you were able to get the infrastructure right so that your core application can shine. That's really what we wanted to get to. You shouldn't give away your core, right? But the point is that if that is your core inside of it, then perhaps there's an argument to be made, hey, come at it with a fully verticalized piece. But from an infrastructure standpoint, we want the infrastructure to be as low cost as possible, as flexible as possible, and as interoperable as possible so we can have as many vendors come in as possible and provide solutions for our customers.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing the AR and VR light feeding. That's exactly one of the key applications for cable industry. And as Farhad mentioned, we don't expect everything can be realized based on the open source, because open source or reference platform enable or accelerate the common part. Itself is not so make money. But important things as you pointed is to very application specific some requirements, because that's exactly a secret sauce. to make it money or business to customer and compete with the other operator. So that's why many people still may misunderstand. I think open source cannot enable everything, but open source is a very useful resources to accelerate because as long as each operator or all the operator or service provider need to develop in any way, open source can take over to leverage, can provide with such a common part. It's much easier for any operator because those kind of a very common platform functionality is almost no differentiator between their competitor, each operator's competitor. So that's why light field, very specific application is exactly the reason why Kevlar is so accelerating and keen and driving is because we believe that's one of the very fundamental, competitive area to compete with AT&T, for example. So that's why those kind of very specific library must be a secret source. However, although this source code itself to meet such a ultra latency requirements and buffering might be a secret source, but still we need openness. So it means a more open API. That's why we try to define what kind of northbound interface is needed.
Or if you have enough conviction that, hey, sure, I'm going to get these accelerators in, and even if you had them, that's not good enough because you still need the other secret sauce that are there. So you give away part of it for free, and you raise the bar for everyone else. But since you're the first one there, you already are the first one who's verticalizing on top of it. Say again? Actually, I don't know. I wasn't involved in that, so I don't know that evolution story as well.
Yeah, the standardization is a lot more slower, right? If that's what you mean. In the open source, people can just pick it up and develop on it, and they can, depending on how good it is, how good the community is, it becomes a de facto standard. That process is faster, and that's why open source is more popular.
Yeah, let me turn around the question a little bit, and maybe you guys can help. Imagine that from 3G to 4G to 5G, now we are increasing the number of radios by million, right? I mean, from worldwide. I mean, I think it was, Chandra had it one of his slides and all of that. Now, if everything is not programmable from the stack all the way down to the FPGA, down to really the hardware level and all of that, imagine what pain we have to go through when 4G comes, right? We don't want to yank everything out, saying that, we have to wait another 10 years for 6G. And then also in addition to that, we have to yank everything out and put new ones because the existing one does not work. We want to have evolution. Obviously, you have to change some software and a lot of hardware as well, but it has to be at least in an evolutionary way to upgrade this to the new innovation that our customers are asking or the industry is asking for. So that's why I'm just saying that it's important. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I'm stuck with Linux, the libraries. I can do acceleration inside the Linux and all of that. But as long as the platforms, are not really locked, then you can innovate, you can change. Then there's opportunity for everyone.
So you're absolutely right, and honestly, you shouldn't make everything open source, right? If you're doing something that's so special that nobody else can offer it without doing with what you're doing, own that IP and build a vertical out of it. But the problem is, if it's only enabling one use case and there's many other use cases that you can enable, you're kind of leaving money on the table for yourself. Because if you take the parts that you've actually opened up, because of your knowledge, you're going to be able to go vertical faster than others. This is true of, like I said, my students are doing this as well. They take some of their stuff. They know, what they do is public domain by definition because that's kind of UC's rules. But they know their stuff really well, and so they can take that and take they're doing a MIMO implementation and say, hey, I know all this stuff, but I'm going to actually make this application work for wireless power. Made up example. But they know how to do that, and they've got that unique expertise. Sure, anybody else could actually reverse engineer and follow the stuff that's public into it, but they don't know. For them to get there is going to take them the time that it took them to get their PhD to go with. So there is a time advantage that you have into it. And then if it becomes something that lots of people are doing, it actually grows the market for the original developer as well. So and it's not going to be true for every use case or every scenario. Some it will, some it won't. It's just a useful thing for us to sort of moderate the influence of any one vendor sort of locking us down, which has actually been a real problem for companies at our scale.
Original question of how do you pick your open source project, right? So in the first case, the community behind the open source disappeared, right? So
I think and the problems you're bringing up are real and they do happen, but that's why there are some projects that get traction, eventually some don't. And I have seen open source software remain in an unoptimized state and sometimes still get traction because there's just no better solution. But it's okay. And at the end of the day, it comes down to who really cares about that software and who is ready to put in the effort to fix it. In your example, somebody tried to fix it, but then there was no recipient on the other side. These are some of the vagaries of open source. But at the end of the day, I feel through such Brownian motion, what emerges finally as the successful open source software, that is cleaned up.
So I think the answer to your question is basically who's behind the open source, right? So open source is really let me complete. So what you're saying is that wasn't tested completely, right? So open source. So I'll tell you, for example, how DPDK works, right? So DPDK started, and when Intel started development on it, they put Intel drivers on it. Now you have ARM, you have Mellanox, you have Cavium. And I was at the last DPDK summit. There was somebody else who raised their hand. This driver is not supported. Well, who stops you from developing that driver for yourself and committing to it? There's a community behind it, and if you upstream the code, there's nobody stopping you. So that's what open source is. It's a voluntary, community. Find a problem, fix it, commit it. That's where, when you pick an open source project, who's the community? That's very important.
Let me add that some of the frustrations that I experienced also is that similarly, you're right, there is a lot of, branching issues. There's a lot of, same questions everyone has, who's going to answer it, and these developers are busy doing their own thing and all of that. They cannot answer how they did it and why they did it. And part of it, maybe this is an opportunity for a lot of solution or system integrators to step up to really bring a solution that, a service provider or a customer needs. And those system integrators, although they are using open source, they are tying these things together. I think we should understand as operators. I think Chris Rice of AT&T, his executive, he said that once, we don't expect open source to be free, right? It doesn't mean that because you're telling us you're doing it based on open source and you have now brought this end-to-end solution, we should not pay you because it's open source. I don't think that mentality should go away. And we expect a lot of system integrators who are using and integrating these open and with their own Tabasco sauce applications, there's a big value for it, and I think the industry needs to understand.
Yeah, I fully understand your frustration because exactly I had such experience when I was in NTT, and that's one of the reasons why I always emphasize even inside the Kebara. So most important things is not how to maximize the open source as is, but how to keep the modularity and how to keep the openness and how to isolate each other. Because you can imagine now in the 5G, it's very, very complicated. Even mobile industry, in the cable industry, is more than mobile, more than cable. And whole the end-to-end network architecture is fully complicated in such a converged network. And without any very good separation and isolation and some open interface is defined, bunch of the open source, a module need to fit in the bunch of the different place, and each open source has a different cadence. It's very hard to control everything in the, for example, half years, replacement and so on. So that's why I'm one of the very strong believer. More important thing for operator is to how to define the isolated open interface and keep the modularity. Not all or nothing, but once particular module can be more easy to replace either in a proprietary solution or any open source, it's much easier as long as there is no any negative and positive impact in the other module in the north and east and the west and the south. So that's why I believe that open source itself is not good enough. That's why equally important is to how to define such an open interface, including some standardized interface and standardized specification, including a data model and a Tosca or Yarn or whatever. That's the open source is very useful to accelerate to enable the reference platform, as long as those kind of open source outcome can be fully modular and replaceable. So that's one of the reasons why I'm still involved in both of the open source and also standard. I'm still a vice chair of the HNFB, and that's exactly the reason.
You made a comment earlier, open source gets funded more. I think proprietary software gets funded more than open source, honestly speaking. Yeah, this becomes a pretty philosophical question, something I used to struggle a lot with. If you build something, the one philosophy is if you build something, build it and they'll come. So basically what it means is don't wait for a problem statement and then build it. Just build it and they'll come. If it is the right piece of technology, right timing, market will find an application and a business problem that's solved by it. The other way is start from the business problem side, right? The reality is the answer lies on both sides, depends, and we have seen both sides succeeding. And back to the open source funding part, there is actually less funding going into open source oriented companies, especially startups, than the other ones. The business model around open source is always challenging. It's mostly services oriented, like Jata was saying. It's not scalable easily. It's expensive, etc., etc. You look at companies like big startups rather, like Cloudera, etc. It's not easy. Databricks, somebody talked about Apache Spark. There are so many examples of companies that have raised money, but still not found a truly scalable business model that gets them to billions of dollars. So there are fundamental challenges, and that's why some part of the VC funding goes to open source, but not the majority.
Sure, not wrong. Yes, the world is, however, more complicated. It just is. And so sometimes you just got to deal with it. I will say there is a huge emergence of companies that are just building the bare metal that I'm seeing right now. So they don't want to deal with any of the overhead. They will basically just cut straight to the bare metal. Don't worry about an operating system, serverless, completely just take the full utilization that they can squeeze out of machines. That's pretty cool too. So let me state it correctly. Have we consumed all the possible set of services that we can possibly do out of 4G, and therefore do we need 5G or not? Obviously, you're never going to be at 100% utilization of it, but it is a capacity constraint problem as well, because there's a whole series of new things that you want to do that you just can't do with 4G. Higher latencies right now make it impossible to do things like offloading compute from the endpoint. So there are a whole series of... Now look, if we take 5G and start applying it to making web pages go faster, it doesn't justify any of the infrastructure. So like any new disruption that happens, you need to, if you follow, what was his name, the Christensen professor from Harvard, he wrote Innovator's Dilemma. You can't succeed with disruptive technology if you're trying to do existing use cases. You have to enable a new class of use cases, and that's what then justifies the jump that you're making. When we, we're bringing out 3G, if nobody really knew what to do with the fact that you could consume content on demand, and if you didn't have an iPhone coming in with Safari, where you could actually find a use case outside of getting your email in an asynchronous way on a BlackBerry, nobody would have really cared. So that was, to Sanjeev's point, build it and they come. We built it, and then fortunately somebody came, and then it became really useful. Have we figured that part out with 5G yet? Nope.
So let me add everything that Faraz said to it. I mean, there are self-driving cars. It cannot be done with 4G. IoT, like massive IoT, I mean, it kills the core network because the number of connection oriented and all of that. RAN slicing, I mean, we cannot really do with, and it's important with all these emerging services that are popping up. So there is a whole slew of services that we are hoping that 5G will enable, and that's an opportunity for all of us.
You need the traffic conditions.
You also need to have coordinated functions, right? Because these radios, I mean, car is moving fast from one radio to another and all of that. If every radio has to make its own decision to communicate, car-to-car communication, etc., you cannot assume that we're going to have direct communication all the time. It has to go through the network to some degree. And if you don't have this coordinated function among all these radios, you won't be able to really massively handle these self-driving cars and all of that. So you do need intelligence at the network for coordinated beams, coordinated, assignments, coordinated functions, predictive analytics, external information about what's happening in the roads, and internal data that you capture from the UEs and cars. We did both.
If you are driving and you see bump on the car, I am in the car behind you, I want that information before I hit the bump. And then your car is not going to talk to my car. That's a whole new communication mechanism. That's not going to happen. But to up level this a little bit, I think if you look at video anywhere for any application today, whether it is car, whether it is surveillance cameras, and surveillance cameras are being deployed 10 per street, that level of count, you're already at the bleeding edge of 4G. You're already pushing the limits. And the question about, hey, have we used fully 4G? I think it's almost irrelevant. If you are already pushing the limits with one use case, you're done. It's time. And number two, it's all about unlocking whole new world of innovation with 5G that we haven't even thought about.
Yeah, so when Boolean invented Boolean algebra, did anybody know what's going to happen with that?
Yeah.
So, I mean, before WhatsApp and Skype and all were invented, nobody knew that would be the killer app. So we're not there yet, but
I would rather encourage the developer ecosystem to think about as if there was 5G today, like AT&T and Cable Labs presented, hey, if the world were there in terms of speed, bandwidth, etc., what would you do? Let's think about that versus saying, hey, are we already good enough? Are we using what we have today?
yeah, that's infrastructure being built out, but it's the developers from whom the killer apps would come. That's the whole reason why we are having this today.
Yeah. that is the core reason.
Yeah, we're going to build it. We just need you to come.
Yeah, yeah. Make sure you come. Otherwise, for us, we're going to sit with, oh shit, my infrastructure is ready. Nobody came to the party.
Yeah, it will be the e-com story 10 years too early, right?
Oh. Don't jinx it. Yeah.
Somebody somewhere is going to do it. We have way too much invested in 4G. We deprecated 2G. We're deprecating 3G. 4G has still got legs, and it's going to last for, there'll be some time before we sunset that. But in some markets, that's the whole advantage of leapfrogging, right? So, what was it? Reliance Jio that did that implementation in India. It was a surprisingly spectacularly successful model. They had no legacy stuff to deal with, and they just leapfrogged over everything. Plus, they did some really, really neat vendor arrangements with Samsung and others to pull it off. But, when you're starting from fresh, you don't have to worry about the past. When you've been around for 160 odd years, you can't let go of everything altogether. That's just the curse of us being us.
Yeah, so
About Radisys, right? So they're working on 5G.
So Kisang is giving up. We're out of time. So any closing thoughts here?
I think, we need to embrace open source and white box. And if, it is not, just is it good for me? And I think it's good for the industry. When it's good for the industry, then it's good for everyone.
Yeah, and I also, repeat to that gentleman's, introducing a light field in the hologram. I would say in the 5G is a totally different journey we are now proceeding. It means and from analog to 4G, operator can manage everything by ourselves. But 5G is very, very most likely out of control because it's fully dependent on the vertical. It means application like automobile and healthcare and hologram and in education and so on. Bunch of the different vertical industry dependency is on top of the network infrastructure. That's why I'm encouraging everyone, including us, me, cable operator and the telecom and the mobile operator and the developer need to be aware of what is the target goal in the industry or vertical target application, as he mentioned. Without any such a target application, looks like from revenue viewpoint, but also in a technical viewpoint, what is the real pain point is to solve some particular program. Because many people talking about edge computing, but edge computing is just one word, but it's fully different, depend on the target application. So that's why maybe I think all of us need to be more aware of what kind of a vertical industry need to be partnership with us.
Developers always have ideas that they don't implement because the infrastructure is not there. So I request all of you to look back at your files and diaries and see, hey, what were the ideas you killed in the last 5 years because the infrastructure was a limiter? It's probably time to bring those out and start exploring and playing with those.
Yeah. Thank you. So,
Sorry. And I think I mentioned this in my slides out there that look, the limitations of technology are still going to be there, but the limitations, what you can't do and what you can do is very different now in a 5G context. And given that we're imagining a world of much faster bandwidths, much lower latencies, there's a new class of applications and scenarios that you can support that you couldn't do before. That does mean a lot of rethinking around some of the paradigms that we think of, like single-threaded or single GPU-based rendering pipelines. That's a limitation right now because we just have one GPU in one box. Now imagine if we had 100 of them strung together. Well, it turns out the laws of physics are still what they are. You can't make a while loop work on 10 different machines. You just can't. Or at least if somebody has, please let me know because I don't know how to do it. But that would be so there will be some limitations that will still apply. But other things, hey, maybe I can turn it into a whole bunch of triangles and split that out amongst a whole bunch of other things and then figure out a way to render them in parallel. There's a lot of things that you can do to reduce the limitations that you were faced with in a 4G world or in previous generations. Sanjeev's absolutely right. You can, the ideas that you had to cut out because technology wasn't there for you, not all of them are going to be there, but they're definitely worth revisiting them now. And this is actually kind of the funnest, most exciting time to be alive at and being out building applications for, because the world is completely different. What you knew before does not have to limit what you could do before. And so now there is a much broader set of things that you can go after because your cost points are going to get lower for the endpoints, because the ability to distribute this compute and storage is going to be so fundamentally different. Your audiences are going to grow way faster, and your ability to monetize what you build is going to be a lot faster than what it was in the past as well.
Yeah, so learn as much as possible about 5G, what's coming, and you have this resources here. They're ready to help you. Reach out to any of us. Yeah, that's my call to action. Thank you so much for being here.